I was born in Chicago. In terms of what's relevant to my scientific career, my father was a structural engineer who had gone to evening classes at Armor Tech in Chicago and had taken the engineering and mathematics courses and got to be a structural engineer in the state of Illinois and designed lots of structures. And I then was in the Army just in the latter year and a half or two in the latter stages of World War II, so I built up some GI Bill credit. And when it came time, my parents died when I was very young, but my sister still had our family home, and so I decided to go to the school that was the successor of Armor Tech, Illinois Tech, on the south side of Chicago, because I could live at home. And with the GI Bill coming in, the economy of being able to live at home was attractive. I should say, while I was at Illinois Tech, the first person I really met who did research in catalysis was Sam Siegel, who was a professor at Illinois Tech at the time. Later became very well known as a professor and catalytic chemist from the University of Arkansas. And I would say Sam was one of the early significant influences on my career. I then applied to several graduate schools, and I was accepted at Northwestern. So at Northwestern, I did my graduate research in physical biochemistry, where they're in clothes. But of course, I became familiar with and was influenced by three people who were well known in catalysis, and their graduate students. I was exposed to a lot of catalytic research through seminars and conversations. They were, of course, Bob Burwell, Herman Pines, and Pierce Selwood. So I became rather familiar with, I forgot, I should go back and say that while I was at Illinois Tech, I did take one course in catalysis under one of the rather well-known Russian chemist, V.I. Komarevsky. And at Northwestern in my early years, across from my laboratory, diagonally across, was a laboratory that V.N. Ipatyev came to every day until on the last week of his life when he died at 85. And Herman Pines was closely associated with him. And while I was at Northwestern, Sir Hugh Taylor came and gave a lecture on catalysis that was of interest to me. When I got out, I chose to go to work in California, in Richmond, California, for the research subsidiary of what was then Standard Oil California, which is now the Chevron Corporation. And we had a research organization that was called California Research Corporation, which later became Chevron Research Company. And when I got there, I went into the Catalyst Research Group. I would say that quite a strong influence on me was Bob Seek, who was my group leader at the time and later my manager. He had an extremely fertile imagination, was really interested in lively personality, interested in research, and would frequently come and discuss things. And when you had results, he'd have 5 different explanations for any set of results that you could choose from among them. Often one was very reasonable. And Hutch Harnsberger later became my group leader after Bob was promoted. I would say that Bob Houston, I shared an office with him and did a number of joint projects with him. He was a good influence to a very productive worker. And I think one of the fairly early things that I was involved in was developing a radio tracer flow system for measuring metal surfaces. I was working at that time actually quite actively for a couple of years on the characterization of hydrocracking catalysts. There was a project in which the isocracking catalyst was being developed, and these various stages were cobalt or nickel and silica alumina, pre-zeolitic. And I did a good deal of work, visible UV spectroscopy and other means, hydrogen consumption, and developed the CO chem absorption technique to measure the metal surface, the amounts of reducible metals, and in fact we found that we did have solid solutions of these transition metal ions in the silica alumina. I also studied similar things on alumina. This flow absorption system was used. I worked with Bob Houston. He played a very major role in applying it to platinum reforming catalysts. And one of the really important early results was the discovery by Bob in a series of experiments that when you heated platinum reforming catalysts in hydrogen, did it with wet and dry hydrogen, and found out there was a very much larger rate of sintering, loss of metal surface, in wet hydrogen than in dry. And this rather quickly was adopted by our commercial plants, and they cut from very wet operation, which would have been advised in the field, to rather dry operation. And immediately they got a 3 to 4-fold extension in life. This is before we could regenerate the catalyst. So this was immediately worth several $1 million a year to the operating companies. And this was just 1 atmosphere of hydrogen in quartz tubes. And the group leader, Hutch Harnsberger, got a very good idea that if we could learn that much from a laboratory experiment, how much more valuable would it be to be able to take reforming catalyst samples out of the plant during operation. So he worked with an engineer, Dick Ellis, to develop the first reforming catalyst samplers. And they went into operation, the first one in the El Segundo refinery, Southern California, in late 1959. And we learned a great deal from them. We could follow the course of metal surface, and of course we could analyze for chlorine and carbon in the catalyst as a function of time on stream. And this led to a number of things. We worked with people in the reforming group, particularly Ron Toberg and Will Honschild. Bob Houston worked very closely with them particularly, and developed our regeneration procedures. And one of the things we learned was that there was a great deal of loss of the platinum surface in the first day on stream, then a gradual loss after that. And we would measure the platinum surface both after simple stripping of the catalyst, so we'd take away volatile hydrocarbons, and after a very mild oxidation. And we found that part of the lost surface could be restored by the mild oxidation, which was really too mild to redisperse the platinum. So out of that came the idea that there were probably 2 principal means for loss of metal surface. One had to do with sintering, and you can't avoid, when you start up a reformer each cycle, having wet hydrogen present. And our picture, rightly or wrongly, was that that was one of the major sources of loss. Another one was carbon deposition. And we had developed these ideas and reported them internally in the company. And then in 1960, Harris Kluckstall joined our group. And he started working in reforming. And after a time, came to the idea that perhaps he could stabilize the catalyst against sintering. Not again, we didn't know about carbon coking deactivation, but sintering by working with a metallic component that had a higher lattice energy. And so he thought perhaps a binary alloy with high melting metals would work. So we got a hold of a handbook of phase diagrams of binary alloys, and found that platinum rhenium alloys had very high melting points. Rhenium is the 2nd highest melting metal next to tungsten. So he tried a number of metals, and platinum rhenium was one of the very early ones. And he found that by heating up to successfully higher temperatures, up to 1600 degrees F, that the platinum only, the monometallic platinum, would drop off and have very little metal surface left after this high temperature treatment, whereas the platinum rhenium catalyst retained a very large amount of surface. And on model systems that had high metal contents, up to 4% metal, we could actually see by X-ray diffraction that the alloy was formed, and by electron microscopy, as well as the line broadening of the electron diffraction, that in fact there was more resistance to sintering. And so Harris prepared a platinum rhenium catalyst and gave it to Bob Jacobson in our reforming development group. And Bob tested it, and it was very interesting. He tried it with a desulfurized feed without pre-sulfiting the catalyst. And for a week or 2, he got mostly methane in the product. And fortunately, Harris had told him what he should be looking for was greater stability, not better selectivity. So he kept going, and then gradually it got better. So he got up to fresh catalyst selectivity, and the catalyst lasted about 4 times as long as any catalyst we'd ever tested before. And that was the beginning of the development of bimetallic reforming catalysts. In a pretty short order, the first commercial test occurred in February of 1967. And this was really the beginning of an important revolution in catalytic reforming, as well as the idea that bimetallic catalysts could be very useful. And Now, the last I looked, 1985 or 6, over 80% of the reforming catalysts in the United States were bimetallic, and of these, all but about 12 or 13% were still platinum rhenium, despite the fact that others like platinum iridium, platinum tin, platinum germanium, and platinum lead have been developed and commercialized later. So this was an exciting development. The head of the reforming group retired in 1970, so I took over. I transferred from the catalyst research to the development division, and I was in charge of the catalytic reforming group for about 6.5 years. This was after the first commercialization, but most of our plants and many licensee plants were converted to platinum rhenium during that period, and we came up with successive improvements. So that was an interesting experience, broadening to get some experience at the development end of things, commercial development as well as the research end. Then I later went in 1976, was transferred back and put in charge of the exploratory process research group for 3 years. And then at Sharpsburg was transferred out to some other job, and in 1979 I was put in charge of catalyst research. Then I think in about 1980 I was made a senior scientist. There were, I think, about 3 in all in Chevron Research at the time. And in about 1985 I was put in charge of a catalyst characterization group. And in 1986, a rather generous offer was made to the long-term employees, which I accepted, and I retired at the end of September of '86. I could go back and reminisce about a few other things I worked on. In the period, I've forgotten, 63, 64, I started working with Harry White of the Analytical Division on infrared studies of catalysts. And we did a good deal of work. I think we have only 2 publications out of it. Our management was rather leery about releasing papers, and so I still have about 4 that I may write up. I think that I'll have to do literature searches, but I think we have about 4 more that, so far as I know, have not been superseded by the literature. So when I get time, I have the idea of writing them up, doing literature searches and updating them. And I worked for a time in the late 60s. We had a lot of propane and butane that was not very economically used in many of our refineries, and so I was trying to think of ways of using it. And I worked on solid alkylation catalysts, tried various zeolitic catalysts, found out that they would work. There was an induction period, and after the induction period was over, there was a period in which there was quite good alkylation activity, but they didn't have lives, at least the catalysts I tested, that were commercially interesting. They would gradually lose the selectivity for alkylation and simply dimerize. So if we had a mixture of butane and butene, the butene would simply dimerize and make octene instead of making isooctanes. And then I attended a Gordon Research Conference in the late 60s by Banks of Phillips, who talked about the olefin disproportionation or dismutation process. So I thought of combining this type of function, making a bifunctional catalyst that had a dehydrogenation activity, and tested a number of different combinations, and actually came up with a catalyst that was reasonably stable and quite selective for converting, well, I think I tried it first on propane. It was quite interesting to see all the normal paraffins come out in order, and later we did other things and found out we could take a high molecular weight and low molecular weight and average them, and there were many, quite a number of patents and a couple of papers came out of that. But it turned out that you had to keep the feed quite clean, and the best dehydrogenation component was platinum, so it was not a cheap catalyst. And the selectivity was such, it was give a broad spread of products, so that economically, although it was, I think, quite interesting scientifically, it didn't get commercialized. Then that was actually the late 60s. I think skipping ahead then after I was doing mostly being a group leader mostly for a while, but then in the 1980s, the last really interesting phase of, I think, the work I participated in personally, was stimulated by a paper in 1980 and some patents from the French company ELF. by Jean-René Bernard, who reported that he had remarkably good selectivity for reforming catalysts for the dehydrocyclization of hexane from catalysts that were made by putting platinum into a potassium L-zeolite. And my friend and colleague Walt Buss, who was in the Reforming Development Group, tested some of these, and they were really quite good. They were as good as Bernard said, but they weren't as stable as could be desired. So I consulted with Walt and suggested that we should try a barium exchange, because I knew from infrared work I'd done in zeolites and some of John Ward's work that the barium, I should say that the ELF people, their patents, specified that at least 90% of the exchange sites should be occupied by alkali metal ions, potassium or others. They were trying to avoid acidity. These catalysts must not be acidic. They showed that the addition of acidity was very bad. And I knew that the barium Y zeolite was less acidic, much less acidic than the other alkaline earths. Magnesium was most acidic, calcium next, then strontium. Barium was least acidic, so we decided to give barium a try. And we found fairly quickly that, in fact, we had a catalyst that was very good, very selective, as selective as the potassium, as the best potassium catalyst we made. And we could make it very stable if we cut the sulfur down to low levels. And I did some infrared work that showed that the barium was initially exchanged into the large pores of the L-zeolite, but upon calcination, it went into the small cages and was no longer accessible to the hydrocarbon reactants. And shortly thereafter, Lovett Rees at Imperial College London published a study in zeolites on Zillard-Chalmers recoil type of study, which showed that exactly what we did, but he generalized it to all of the alkaline earths, that in L-zeolite, that what he called the open sites in the large channels, barium would initially exchange into them, and upon high temperature calcination, the barium would move into the what he called lock sites in the small cages. And in fact, our infrared results showed that after the calcination at 1100 degrees F, that we could detect. We used the same sort of technique that John Ward had already published for various exchange ions in Y zeolite. And we found out that whereas we got a preponderance of pyridine barium interactions before the high temperature calcination, after low temperature drying, after the high temperature calcination, we couldn't see any more pyridine barium interactions. That basically the barium apparently went into the locked sites in the small cages. And we had a tentative explanation that it was easier to get to the exact stoichiometric neutralization of the sites, the exchange sites in the zeolite, by doing the barium exchange, and then by calcining they would go into the small channels. So this, I enjoyed very much talking about this at an international zeolite conference in Tokyo, the last paper I gave while I was at Chevron Research in August of '86, and this work has continued, and I think there is commercial potential for such catalysts. I've certainly enjoyed meeting people in catalysis, and I've given a few talks at international congresses and meetings in Beijing and various parts of the world. So it's been a very rewarding career. I've met a large number of very fine people, and I've been doing some editing and consulting since my retirement, and some writing, scientific writing. And so I've continued to attend a few of the meetings and enjoy the continued association with people in the catalytic community.
Did you publish the radiometric method with CO adsorption?
Yeah, I presented it first at a Gordon Research Conference. I should have said there was another influence. When I was president of the Alpha Chi Sigma chapter at Northwestern in 1982, we had an annual lecturer. And our annual lecture that year was Val Hensel. And I remember taking him out to dinner and introducing him to the group, to the Alpha Chi Sigma lecture audience. The next time I saw Val was in 1958, 6 years later. when he was chairman of the Gordon Conference on Catalysis, and this time he introduced my talk in which I presented that radio tracer CO method. Bob Houston then presented that at an ACS meeting in the spring of Boston in the spring of '59, and in a symposium in which my person I later became a friend with and joined Chevron Research many years later, Bob Van Noornstrand was chairman. And we didn't get around to writing it up until we finally published it. It was in the preprints in '59. We published it in INEC in 1962. But the method was still being used 30 years later. So it was a very convenient method. It was a way in which an able technician could run 8 metal surfaces a day, and we studied it for platinum, nickel, cobalt, palladium, reduced chromia, and many of the transition metals after suitable reduction, or even transition metal oxides like chromia, could be studied. And in fact, Bernie Molaski was working on chromia alumina catalysts and showed that the CO chem absorption results correlated linearly with the butane dehydrogenation results in a low conversion differential reaction type test. So that we were fairly early. We certainly weren't the first. There were people who had studied hydrogen and CO chem absorption. In fact, Emmett and Brunauer had done some work of that sort at the fixed nitrogen laboratory. But they were studying ammonia synthesis catalysts and Fischer-Tropsch catalysts that were mostly metals. So they studied the interaction, the chem absorption of CO at liquid nitrogen or liquid air temperature. And it turns out that this is fine if most of the surface is metal surface and the promoter is a small component. But if you have a few tenths% platinum on alumina, 200 square meter per gram alumina, the absorption at liquid nitrogen temperature is completely swamps out. The absorption of CO swamps that of the metal. But if you do it at ambient temperature, you have only a small blank on the oxide support. And so this was widely used in many of the Chevron research and development projects for the next 30 years.
Why would anyone run a reactor for a week in reforming if all you're making is methane with the sulfur addition?
Well, I think Jacobson really thought it would take a while. He was aware that you read many papers in the literature in which people will give you initial activity or activity after a few hours. And Jacobson was aware that catalysts, he had been in development in hydrocracking and hydroprocessing, and he had a number of years' experience by that time. And he knew that he was not a greenhorn. He knew that you sometimes had to wait until catalysts stabilized, and he was just unusually patient. If he hadn't been that patient, any great advance in catalysis would have died. But it was really the combination of his patience and Kluckstall, of course, keeping in touch and reminding him that it was really ultimately better stability that he expected. So Jacobson deserved a lot of credit for sticking with that. And I think perhaps what happened was we didn't do trace sulfur analyses as well then as we did later, but he had a nominally desulfurized feed that probably had a very small sulfur content, and he and I both talked about it later and decided that probably the catalyst was very gradually, over a period of a couple of weeks, becoming sulfided. And so that was I think, of the developments that I was associated with in any way, certainly the development of bimetallic reforming catalysts, the platinum rhenium was the most exciting and had the most commercial consequences.
And how would you describe Komorowski as a teacher and as a person?
He's a very dignified, austere sort of person who came on sort of like a Russian aristocrat who he was toward the end of his career then. He was much older than I was in my early 20s, and he was probably mid-60s, and he was a very courtly type person, I thought. I think he made the subject interesting. He was not into he was much before the surface physics like Ipatiev. Catalysis was, in the earlier years, was largely empirical, and he was a master of that sort of empiricism, correlating observations. And so it was a classical type history of early catalysis and a story of developments he had participated in some and certainly observed others close hand. So it was interesting, but it was, to a large extent, it was catalysis as an art and only partly as a science. and it's still only partly a science.
What size class would you be in this?
I've forgotten, but I would guess it was in the 20-odd. It was not a terribly small class, but it wasn't a huge auditorium full of people. I would think 20 to 30 would be my guess.
Did he get to know each student, or was this just a lecture type course?
Not intimately. We would ask questions and such, and I think he knew our names for the time, but I don't think that 5 years later he would have recognized us.
How would you describe Selwood while you were at Northwestern?
Well, he was a very good teacher. He taught structural inorganic chemistry in the first year in graduate school, and he was, again, a rather reserved person. I think he was stimulating. I think he had a number of very excellent students, and they would be in labs down the hall from mine, so I certainly became quite aware of what he was doing in applying magnetism to the study of catalysts. I'd say, again, a little austere. I don't think he wasn't really a buddy. He was, again, a man who was, he was a generation older than most of the graduate students at the time, and he was rather reserved. But later on, I got to know him at Gordon Conference. He had a good, quiet sense of humor, and I got to know him better in later years.
What sort of a lecturer was Sir Hugh Taylor?
Well, he gave something that was the 1951, I suspect it was the century, the 100th anniversary of Northwestern. So we had people like Enrico Fermi and Hugh Taylor and others come, and inspirational, I would say. He gave a rather general lecture. It wasn't even just to chemists. And he pointed out some of the interest in the drama of catalysis, and it was historical but lively. He was a lively lecturer, and that was a huge auditorium, probably a couple thousand people, but it was rather inspiring.
Why did you choose industry rather than an academic pursuit?
I don't know. I would say that I think in some schools, some universities, graduate students, a fairly large percentage went to academic pursuits. Some did, certainly from Northwestern, but at the time I was going there, I think most of the people were perhaps, we were a little older. I'd been out of high school for 3 years. I'd been in the Army, and probably were ready to, I'm not sure whether we're materialistic, but you could certainly make more money from industry. That was a sizable factor, and at the time I think almost all of the classmates I had got their PhD degrees about the time I did went into industry, and I guess I just sort of did it without very seriously considering the alternative.
Looking back, you think you would have stayed in catalysis if you'd have gone academic, or?
I think it's quite possible. I think that there have been, it's certainly a field in which there's a great deal of scope. It's not a field, despite the fact that the funding agencies have come to think of catalysis as a mature discipline, and right now catalysis, compared with the contribution it makes to the GNP and the value added, I noticed in one of the volumes of the proceedings of this meeting that is it this meeting? No, it was at the third North American Chemical Congress last week, on the ACS meeting in Toronto, that Jim Roth was making some estimates as to the economic contributions to catalysis, and making it very large. Many of the contributions were made by empirical research, rather clever empirical research, and I think catalysis is mature enough now so that it's not as well supported, I think, by the NSF, for example, as some other fields that are newer, and I somewhat understand that. Although, as I've looked in the 3+ decades I've been in catalysis, there have been continued to be major developments in catalysis that have greatly affected the petroleum and chemical industries. Just to cite a few, the development by union carbide of the X and Y zeolite. The synthesis of phlogisite was known in nature, but in only trifling amounts that couldn't have been commercialized. And Charlie Planck and Ed Rosinski of Mobil found out how to make cracking catalysts that contain first rare earth X catalyst, later Y, and there have been many developments in that field for the past more than 25 years now. They've taken over the field completely, and so catalytic cracking, we're using petroleum much more efficiently than if it hadn't been for catalytic cracking. Union Carbide and Union Oil, Roland Hanford and John Ward and others have used them in hydrocracking catalysts, and now they're generally used in hydrocracking catalysts. It's greatly improved that process. Certainly bimetallic reforming catalysts have made possible the achievement of high octanes without, in unleaded gasoline, without the tremendous loss of the product that would have occurred if it had to be done with monometallic platinum catalysts. We would have needed a whole lot more reforming capacity because the stability and the selectivity stability, the ability to go in and have a catalyst to run, a semi-regenerative catalyst run for half a year or a year, and at the end have essentially the same stability, the same selectivity, same gasoline yield and hydrogen yield as at the beginning, is very different from the monometallic catalysts. And so there's an enormous economic benefit from that. The high silica medium pore zeolites, the ZSM5 is the most notable example that Mobil has developed, have really led to many commercial processes, and certainly they lead to the livelihood of many academic catalytic chemists. I was amused a few years ago, the British Zeolite Association was selling neckties with a structural unit, the pentasil structural unit. All of their most of their academic members do a great deal of their research on these intermediate pore zeolites, and certainly many of the industrial members are doing research on them. I went over to Tsukuba, the Japanese science city, in '86 and spent a day there, and a lot of their research is on these medium pore zeolite modifications of ZSM5 and process applications. So I don't see a slacking off in the rate at which major new developments are coming along in metal catalysis, in zeolitic catalysis. Mark Davis of Virginia Poly has recently come up with a larger pore zeolite, or molecular sieve of the aluminum phosphate type, which is a research goal for decades now. And I think that catalysis is very difficult to see other than extensions of what we already know, which certainly will occur, what contributions it'll make, but my guess is that catalysis will make further advances, and particularly as petroleum prices, the projections from the early 70s, mid-70s, where the petroleum prices would continue to rise very rapidly in the rest of the century. But the savings, the conservation moves brought about by the high prices of oil, the price rises during the 70s, have really cut the consumption we didn't get for a number of years, this exponential growth in consumption. And this has led to much lower prices than we would otherwise have had. And so right now, the incentive for really efficient use of petroleum is less than it will be as petroleum gets to be higher priced. And so I think that further novel developments and major breakthrough in catalysis will be, and related to synthetic fuel processing, will become more important. The incentive will get to be larger as we have to use petroleum still more efficiently and make fuels and chemicals out of synthetic fuels.
What would you say is the biggest differences as you contrast industry when you started and now as far as research goes?
Well, there certainly has been a significant contribution in many of the laboratories of the catalyst characterization techniques that certainly we've used. I mentioned infrared, for example, in these paraffin dehydrocyclization catalysts, the non-acidic monofunctional platinum barium alzeolite. And there have been many other cases in which catalyst characterization techniques have been used to characterize the catalyst. We were working much more empirically 30-odd years ago then now we can really get a partial understanding. Usually it's a partial understanding. There are remaining ambiguities, but we can, in science, as you know, Burt, we don't ever prove anything for sure, but we can disprove hypotheses. So you form hypotheses, that sometimes several, 2 or more alternative hypotheses, and experiments, catalytic and sometimes physical characterization, can sometimes eliminate some of these, and we can become gradually increase the probability that one hypothesis is right and another is not right, and this then can help to focus the work toward further improvements. So I'd say that the science of catalysis has advanced a great deal. There still will probably always be art, because it's catalysts are really these high surface area catalysts that have very small particles. Are very difficult to characterize except in model systems like single crystals, which are helpful but don't reproduce all of the complexity of the actual catalysts. And so I'd say that the ratio of science to art has increased considerably, but still inventiveness, artistry, having a green thumb, a little luck, is still very important in making commercial advances in catalysis.
And the way the research is viewed by management when you started versus now?
That goes through cycles, and it goes through cycles in different companies. When I first started, even before that, I became aware that shell development in Emeryville and Amsterdam had really played a quite preeminent role. Otto Beek, who was a really great scientist, died very young, in his 50s, early 50s, I think, and the shell effort in Amsterdam, in Emeryville tapered off. Later, the Emeryville lab was closed. And the baton was passed to other groups. The Houdry process had some very able people for a time. They had, Alex Oblandt and Heinz Heinemann, Alex Mills, Volz, others, Saul Weller. And they were dispersed. They went around, many of them made major contributions in other organizations or universities. Exxon, when I first went to a Gordon conference in 1958, Exxon got a lot of patents but had very few papers. Later, during the 60s, they started publishing a great deal. And I think starting in 68, they started a corporate research laboratory and did quite a lot of fundamental research. And for perhaps 18 years, 17, 18 years, they did some of the best fundamental research in areas related to catalysis and surface science. Unfortunately, they were cut back about 50% quite recently, corporate research. And perhaps it's fortunate that the management attitudes are not synchronized because the leadership, the scientific leadership, really passes from one company to the other. If they were really synchronized, I think we'd all go out of business at one time. But fortunately, they're not. Mobil has done it just well. Union Carbide and Mobil are really the world's leading industrial research organizations and development in the zeolite field. We had efforts, Exxon and other companies have, but small compared to those of Union Carbide and Mobil. They've maintained them for a long time. Union Carbide, since they started a zeolite synthesis program, I think in 1948, from what I've heard and read. And Mobil, somewhat later than that, but probably the late 50s. And they've sustained efforts, and they've made major contributions, and somehow their management has had the tenacity to stick with it and support it. And I rather think and hope that they've benefited enough so they'll keep on. They have some continuity. We need that, really. In this country, for example, I think that as I go to meetings, the International Zeolite Conferences, I've been to the ones in Naples and Reno. I organized the catalytic zeolite catalysis session there, and then Tokyo, where I gave a paper in '86. I must say that the American academicians are not very, a few of them are, but we don't have the integrated efforts they have in some of the foreign countries. I would say that there were about as many papers submitted from Belgium in the Reno International Zeolite Conference in 1983 as there were from the U.S. And certainly the East Germans are very active in the field. They have excellent efforts at Leipzig and East Berlin. The British have some good workers, and the America research in zeolites, Union Carbide, and mobile laboratories really dominate to a large extent. We have only a few isolated laboratories and academic laboratories that are really active. Some of them are very good, but they're small efforts compared with many of the, and the Japanese are coming along very strongly. So I'd say maybe it's fortunate that I can't say that things have just gone up or down. They've gone up in some places and down in others, and fortunately out of phase. Any other questions, Bert?
No.